Thank you everybody for coming to today's South Kohala Coastal Partnership Speaker Series. And today's speaker is Kamuela Plunkett. And Kamuela was raised on Hawaii Island in Waimea. And after school, Kamuela moved to Oahu for work, first in transportation and then in construction, where he could not help but notice how rapidly Hawaii was changing and often wondered what a balanced path forward would look like given Hawaii's traditional and colonial history. Complex topics like these encouraged Kamuela to enroll in UH Manoa, where he earned a BA in anthropology focused on Polynesian migration and archaeology related to traditional food production. While advocating for resource preservation and restoration, Kamuela realized that much of the conflict between communities that concern sustainable management and cultural natural resources and development occurred in land use permitting arena. So for his master's thesis, Kamuela bridged his cultural resource background with government land use planning to create cultural landscape GIS model that overlays place-based, traditional, and early historical land uses on the current landscape. And in the process, Kamuela developed the methods and policy rationale for spatial resource inventory and baseline land use comparative analysis and assessments that could help communities and government agencies navigate a balanced approach to update land use designations and zoning. And with this project, Kamuela earned a master's in heritage management from UH Hilo, and shortly after was employed as a Hawaii County landscape planner, and currently is a climate adaptation planner and research scientist fellow funded by USGS via the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. And we are grateful to have him here today to present his presentation, Waimea Kalana, Lessons for Land Use Planning from a Cultural Landscape.
Thanks, Lauren. Aloha, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be here today. And it's an honor to share with you folks. I am just going to pull up presentation, hopefully, and get started shortly. How's that, Lauren? Is it up?
It's up. It's perfect.
Okay. So I'm just gonna hop right in, folks. So Waimea Kalana, lessons for land use planning from a cultural landscape. I'm gonna begin by just situating this cultural landscape. When we think of Waimea today, we think of this town. But according to the Boundary Commission records, there were, and this was during the 1860s, when the Hawaiian government was trying to take stock of what lands were left post the Mahele. And so they went around and they got testimony from Kama'aina of the islands. So this is from a native resident that lived in the area, and the testimony was given in 1865. It says, "I live in Waikoloa. I am Kama'aina of the lands in dispute." The dispute is not really a dispute. They're just trying to settle the boundaries between George Hueo Davis and King Kamehameha V at that time. And so he goes on to say, Waimea is a kalana, which is the same as an island divided into districts. There are 8 okana in Waimea. In those okana are those lands said to extend out. These lands came into the possession of Kamehameha I. So there's a a Kama'aina testimony of that period, 1865. So what is a Kalana? According to Kamakau, Samuel M. Kamakau, the Hawaiian historian, he says, a Kalana is like a moku aina, and a moku aina is a moku or a district. There's a large division of the island. The Okana are divisions within the moku aina or Kalana, and Ahu Pua'a are the many divisions within the moku aina or Kalana. So all of a sudden, we need to realize that Waimea is not this small town that we see today. It's a bigger traditional land division. And I just start with that because if we're gonna begin reforming or reconciling our land use practices for a more sustainable, a more resilient tomorrow, we have to draw on some of the wisdom that the kupuna of these islands acquired over generations of being in place. Yeah? So, and this information is that I'm sharing today is based, and it's adapted from my master's thesis that was called Waimea's Heritage Landscape. I use this picture here on with the historic trail adjacent to this golfing resort community down in South Kohala at the coast, because this picture reflects two different perspectives of how we can view the landscape. And it's from these perspectives that one, there's many conflicts about land use today in Hawaii, but also when we think about going forward to be a more sustainable society, this also reflects two different perspectives of negotiating that future. So I'll just go over a little bit about me, just because there is this part of my perspective is just growing up here. Yeah, so currently I am a fellow, a climate adaptation planner and research fellow with PICAST, which is the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center. And this fellowship is administered through the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. Prior to this role, and I just started, and so just to let you folks know, I'm adapting my cultural landscape knowledge to issues of climate adaptation. That's my current. Prior to that, I spent 4 years at the Hawaii County Planning Department as a long-range land use planner. Prior to that, I had acquired my master's in heritage management, in which I bridge cultural landscapes and governmental land use planning. Prior to that, I had I got an anthropology bachelor's degree from UH Manoa. Lauren kind of shared this already, but yeah, specifically in archaeology related to traditional food systems. Prior to that, I want to shout out to Windward Community College. I studied Hawaiian Studies and Western Astronomy. And then before that, so I was a non-traditional student. I went back to school in my 30s. And I had worked for a while in tourism and construction in my early childhood. Adulthood on Oahu. And it's during that time that I started to say, you know, I don't know, and I'm contributing to this changing landscape. And I just had so many questions about how do we go forward given the challenges that Hawaii faced. And then prior to that, yeah, I grew up on the Big Island, both in Waimea and the latter part of my childhood on East Hawaii. So why do I go through this? Because my questions developed over a lifetime of seeing land use change and land use conflicts, really. And specifically, Waimea has undergone a lot of change. Also, while I was in school, but part of going back to school was these conflicts, and how community voice really has a challenge in making it into the land use arena when it concerns permits and development. And then there's these questions like, or these statements of keep the country, right? And at the heart of it, you hear some cry for preservation of a sense of place, right? But this one study in 2009 in Laie, they asked the question, well, what does keep the country mean, right? And that's where it gets really difficult. Like, how do you articulate what changes are okay and what changes aren't okay? And that's really difficult for communities to articulate, even though they feel it strongly. It's also hard for developers and permitting officials to understand what the rejection of the proposals are, and they don't know what to do with that information as well. So, I wanted to tease out, if we're going to negotiate the future, you have to have, and for Hawaii's case, is to tease out standards that can be compared, right? In a way that can be compared with today's system. So part of this work is to tease out and articulate what communities, both just residents, but then also lineal descendants too, helping them to articulate what they're talking about. So the basic tenets of cultural landscape, a cultural landscape model is that ahupua'a sustainability, which is well spoken of nowadays, meaning a lot of people know about it by hearing about it. But the truth is, the only reason why ahupua'as were sustainable was because they were part of a district model. Because the district model, or the district land divisions actually were drawn according to watersheds and common water catching and draining systems. So what is the scale at which you do sustainable planning? It has to begin at the moku level, at the district level. Moku scale resource management was an embedded strategy in traditional land division boundaries. It was bio-eco-cultural. And why I put that is because some people say it's biocultural, other people say no, it should be eco-cultural. I don't really care about the debate. I think we're all trying to say something similar. So anyway, protections of watersheds benefited all other VAL. And so going back to the district level, if you plan according to the district and the resources of the district, everything below that top portion of the watershed benefits from that. We'll see later about how some of these upper parts of the landscape, a district landscape, were sectioned off, and they coincide with the watershed, but they were also known as a resource commons for the rest of the peoples living below could access. But what I think is interesting is that that same watershed and cloud forest was also designated the Wau'akua. And so the realm of the gods, right? And so in Europe, they talk about the tragedy of the commons, meaning like when you have a commons, it's possible for people to overtake and greedily take. But when you overlay a a deeper sense of connection to place. That's almost like a preservation easement or a conservation easement. And everybody understood that we go in there, this is not take all you can before somebody else takes. And I'm just trying to relate that embedded in these boundaries was much more than lines on a map. And the trails going Makai and also across the landscape supported equity and resilience for the entire district. So our current TMK parceling and zoning process are these lines overlaying on the landscape for ownership, but they don't honor the resources. That's not how they're drawn. So the Heritage Landscape Resource Inventory Model, or you could call it a Cultural Landscape Resource Inventory Model. I was trying to develop a way to capture all of these things and plug them into one GIS reference model. Why I call it an inventory model? When development requires an EIS or an AIS, so an environmental impact statement or an archaeological inventory survey, it's always in reaction to a proposed development. What we need to do is do these large inventories prior to development. That's another thing that my thesis was trying to argue. The other thing is, again, coming back to community voice, how does it make it into the land use process? And we do have the general plan, and we also have community development plans that are supposed to help community voice get into land use planning. So again, I'm not one to just point fingers. I get involved, and so I'm gonna say, right, I went to school, but I also worked in the planning department, and I'm not pointing fingers at individuals. I'm just gonna say that the system is not conducive to that goal. That community voice still has a struggle in having equity in land use, planning, and permitting. So how I saw this happening is that communities would work along with subject matter experts to look at their landscape at the appropriate scale, spatially map out where these resources are or where they were. And these are both cultural and natural resources. So archaeological, but also natural, streams, forests. And so trying not to separate the two. And so the model was proposing that when the community, along with subject matter experts, are able to represent these things on the landscape, you put it on a GIS model, it gets updated every so often. And at that stage, every time it's updated, the community can come together, review the information together, and start to articulate why it's significant and what the appropriate land use is for those resources. And then in between, that map could then sit in between a community-based heritage program or cultural program and governmental land use planners. And, I know it seems like very ambitious or aspirational, and it is, but in my schooling, I've done numerous field schools and outreach projects and communities. So this is an example of a field school that we did on the North Shore of Oahu, in which it's centered around a particular heiau that Kamuela Schools was thinking about restoring. But then the conversations engaged the community and talked about the broader landscape and how that project was situated amongst larger ideas about the area and the community. So maybe it might seem like a challenge today, but we have many examples of how this type of engagement, higher level engagement, can happen. So for now, I'm just going to give a brief overview of Hawaii's current land use structure. So Hawaii state level land use law under Chapter 205 categorizes lands throughout the whole state as urban, rural, agricultural, or conservation. And then I think every county except Honolulu County has a general plan. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, each county has a general plan, and they try to create, and these are just examples. At the county level, there's much more land use designations in their general plan than these. These are just examples, but they try to create more diversity, but trying to match the uses suggested by the state. And this is all spatial. And then each county has a zoning code. So for example, a zoning code for like a single family residential area, that's where that type of use is going to be. There's resort, there's different types of agriculture, and so on and so forth. But it's really at the county zoning where the permitting, I see the most challenges happening, but it fits within this sequential structure. So what is the methods for when they map these designations out? This is from Hawaii County's general plan, which is under revision. I don't know how far along they are in the process, and so maybe their methods have changed. I left a few months ago, but I want to read you the methods of when this plan was created. So the methodology used to develop the land use pattern reflects estimates of future population based on economic and employment evaluations, existing land uses and zoned areas, determination of community facility needs, and transportation demands for the entire island. The topography and other physical features of each area were also analyzed, and other factors, particularly economic, social, and physical characteristics, were noted. So it's not that it's bad, but if you notice that the whole world is talking about resilience, it's talking about sustainability, environmental concerns, climate change. These methods are not going to get us there, right? So it's so important to review the methods. Because again, we can say we want to head our society and environment to head in a certain direction. But if our government isn't changing their methods, then you're not going to get a different result. The other thing is, and we can see this in terms of values and priorities, right? So land use priorities evolve over time, and in Hawaii, mainly because of what the political economy, what the perceived economic engine is that we have value for, and that it's backed up by the governmental structure. So when you see the phrase political economy, it's not Republican versus Democrat. That's not, it's an older anthropology term, if any of you guys want to read it up. But so given those four, at the state level, those four major breakdowns of urban, rural, agriculture, and conservation, that law came into place in 1961, I believe. But we got to remember that at that time, Hawaii had just become a state. And prior to that, it was a territorial government, mostly run by the Big Five. And so economics professor David Cali says, according to him, the professor of economics at the University of Manoa, the State of Hawaii's Land Use Commission and early land use laws were meant to serve the Big Five. These were economic, agricultural, but monocrop plantation giants in the islands. They were a powerful private landholding oligarchy that economically rose after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So we got to realize that the original dividing or carving up and designating was to serve these guys. Now we look as agriculture, that plantation agriculture slowly started to phase out. And again, this is my experience in my lifetime. Driving from Waimea to Hilo as a kid, all we used to see is sugarcane, right? And then that slowly phased out. And this is the thing we need to be concerned, not just with sugarcane, but also the large ranches. As agriculture becomes less profitable, we're going to see the land start, those same lands are going to start to grow something else. They're going to start to grow modern development. That's just the pattern that we all see, that I've seen and experienced, especially from working in the planning department. So here's the shift. So the general plan I was just talking about, it has the, and I think this is going to be phased out, but I just wanted to show how priorities and values change over time and how that relates to land use. The general plan land use pattern allocation guide map shall also designate areas for urban expansion. An area is designated as urban expansion when the specific settlement pattern and types of uses have yet to be determined. So that's just an easy way of saying, if we're not too sure what the best land use is, let's just designate it a placeholder as urban expansion. So you see that bent is like, we want things to go this way. So, okay, that's current methods. And I just want to talk about the importance of traditional knowledge. So again, I studied Polynesian migration in my schooling, right? So the Proto-Polynesians left Taiwan about estimated, and again, this is one narrative based on archaeology, linguistics, and I think ethnobotany. But so there's different narratives, different timelines, but roughly about 4,500 years ago, the Proto-Polynesians left Taiwan, coming down towards today what would be the Philippines islands, with a different wave coming in through Indonesia, coalescing on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea before jutting out into the remote Pacific. Well, why I point this out is because there's been over 4,000 years of island management that has been gained over this journey, right? The ike, the knowledge that is wrapped up in traditional management is not, while early colonial thinkers thought it was primitive, it was based on 4,000 years of knowledge. If you think about the Enlightenment in Europe, that kind of sparks and influences the way we perceive and value things today, that's like around the 1500s, with the Baconian method of science emerging around that time. Yeah, traditional knowledge is much older. The other thing is Polynesians, and this map just shows the how humans, basically the Polynesians, spread the sweet potato across the Pacific. There's many different layers of evidence that shows that we made it to South America. The main one being the Uala. So if we came from Southeast Asia, we were in the Pacific, we settled in the Pacific, but we also made it to another continent. I like to point this out because the islanders chose to live on islands. Like, we came from a continent, we made it to another continent, but we chose to live on islands. And I believe that's because we were not afraid of scarcity, because we had learned management, island resource management. And this slide just, again, I'm comparing methods, right? There's observation and there's science that is informing the konahiki, or the land manager, of how to use these resources in relation to society, and also the heavens, or their spiritual framework. Okay, wow, that was a lot. So anyway, I'm gonna start talking about the boundaries, but actually these boundaries are part of 4 layers that I argue that if a community creates these 4 layers for their district, for their place, how they can start to derive a more balanced land use. So anyway, starting with the traditional boundaries. So today's map, we see all of these different land divisions for South Kohala. And I just want to say that I'm using all of South Kohala today because the traditional boundaries show that all of the Ili and Ahupua'a, instead of being of South Kohala, they actually all said that they're part of Waimea Kalana, which I mentioned earlier. The only ones in the current South Kohala district today that doesn't say that is Kauai 1 and 2. So I'm talking about Waimea Kalana, which is everything in yellow. But I just talked about Waimea Kalana and South Kohala as the same for today's purposes. So the difference in the 2 perspectives of landscape is huge, right? Waimea as a town, and this CDP stands for Census Designated Place. This is how the federal government kind of distinguishes Waimea, and it is a pretty good representation of Waimea as the town, right? But aside from just a big difference in acreage, which means that there's a different resource management strategy, by taking a look at this CDP, you see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 fragmented ahupua'a, right? So when we talk about preservation of place, but then also sustainability, again, it's the traditional moku or kalana that is informing that more sustainable strategy represented in the divisions themselves. So when you when you fragment the traditional boundaries, you're also fragmenting its sustainable properties. This is just a review of how a kalana acts as a district. So Pai'aina is your archipelago, your mokupuni is your islands within that archipelago, and then moku, moku'aina, or kalana, kalana behaves like a district, like a moku, in that they both can contain other divisions within them, such as Ahupua'a and Ilu. So layer 2 is looking at the landscape and the view sheds. And this is really trying to get at sense of place. But also, I show this map because there's trails running Malcolm Mackay. And according to Holly McIndowney, she says, you know, these trails didn't just go Malcolm Mackay, they also led to resource gathering spots within the landscape. Yeah, so here's the boundary of the district, Waimea Kalana coming till about here. And I just highlighted one trail that runs kind of in the plateau, the flatter portion running Malcolm Mackay, in between the two mountains of Kohala and Mauna Kea. And just showing that actually some of these pu'u, these blue dots, correlate to pu'u. But when you're looking from the landscape, so here's the plane going Malcolm Mackay. That's another angle. So here's some photos of that plane running in between the two mountains. And here's a good shot. So when you're traversing Malcolm Mackay, these pu'u are, one, you know that they're showing you the district boundary, but they're also giving you relationships between interior land divisions. So sense of place, when you're walking Malcolm Mackay and you're going to see your ohana in the uplands, you know what territories you're crossing through. That's why trails are so important for reconnecting our current society to place. The third layer is a vegetation reconstruction. Again, Holly McIndowney created this map. She created this vegetation reconstruction as estimates based on what was remaining on the landscape, but then also on historical accounts. And this was really pivotal in the research. So I basically overlaid her map and tried to identify where these land uses were, and she did a good job of also stating what kind of plants were in each zone. Sorry, I gotta speed this up. But here you go, your agricultural lands. This layer, so that top band, you see Ohia rainforest, the Ulu La'au, which is basically agroforestry in the land records. And then getting closer to Mauna Kea, there was an open canopy, so less dense, but there was still forest in what we see as pastures today. And then if you realize that around Mauna Kea was this band of mamane forest, you basically had a continuous forest from Kohala Mountain across the plain to Mauna Kea. So why is that important? If you look at the shape of this ahupua'a that caps the lower ahupua'a, in relation to the reconstructed vegetation, you see that pu'ukapu was actually a strategic shape. It looks funny, but it looks funny because it's drawn to the resource. It's not drawn according to a grid, it's drawn to the resource and how the resource can be shared. So Waikoloa is super dry, as most of you guys know, but if you look, Waikoloa extends this small, tiny way up here into the Kohala Mountains, again, into the resource commons, but also Waikoloa stream. They have access to water, even at the worst of times. The other thing about this forest, again, a purposeful land division coinciding with the forest, that actually, even though there's not many streams in South Kohala, the ankyline pools that made these fishing villages at the coast possible, meaning water at the bottom, is related to these shapes of Malka, of management, these land divisions of management. So Lorenzo Lyons and CJ Lyons, they're right about these. And basically they're saying the basic ahupua'a runs up into the woods, but then there's these other ahupua'a that cap them. And Lorenzo Lyons says that he believes that these were resource commons that the lower ahupua'a could access. Here's another layer in relation to aquifers and streams. This one is important because at the coast, again, we only have 1 or 2 streams actually. So Ponokoa is in Kauai, I believe. So it's really just 1 or 2 streams that make it all the way to the ocean. But the distribution based on the Anke line pools and fish ponds is distributed throughout Lalamilo, Kalahuipua'a, and Anaiho'omalu. Again, this is all coming from Malka. And Lily Kalana talks about how she believes Moku districts were subterranean water management areas, and they were. So it was forested watershed, but also subterranean water flow. The last layer I wanted to talk about is traditional agriculture. And this is based on overlaying archaeological research, as well as some field studies and some remote sensing. I'm just gonna run through this. I gotta leave time for questions. So a big part of this is this 1914 map that documented, and there was a water dispute between the territory of Hawaii and Parker Ranch. And so Walter E. Wall was commissioned to document the waterways and then also the Hawaii. And I just overlaid that on the current landscape. This was another study that documented 4 field complexes in Waimea. Oh, I went backwards. Okay. So with that overlaid map and realizing that one of the main channels came off of Waikoloa Stream, I decided to walk Waikoloa Stream. This is right in my town, but I went with a GPS point and it says, you know, that bend in the map, I think I can find it. So I went, took my GPS point. I said, okay, I think this is it. I stood in the middle of the stream. I took a point. And then I overlaid the map with the point, and it aligns to what is labeled Akona's Awai. Now, this picture here that is above the nature park is actually Akona's Awai. People think it's a trail, and it is a trail today. But this was the beginning of Akona's Awai that fed into field complex number 3, I believe, which is over 3,000 acres of irrigated traditional agriculture that not many people remember because it's all under pasture. Again, land use change over time, and then we start to forget what the possibilities of our sustainable landscape are. So just adding all of that up with the Ulula'au, the agroforestry area, and most of Waimea town was actually traditional agriculture. Again, trying to help people with perception of place. Over 4,000 of acres of that was irrigated. Anyway, you take all of that, and I created this metric based on, for each one of those layers, looking at what the elements of their layer, that layer is, and run it across these criteria. Hawaiian Resource Management, UNESCO Cultural Landscape criteria, which accounts for both cultural and natural resources. What was the traditional or natural function of that resource, and what perceptions like perception of place, because this gets down to what is the sense of place. So after you take each one of those layers, fill out and articulate for each one of the resources, you can then create statements of significance. And these statements of significance are actually land-based, right? They're spatial, and it's backed up by data. And then you can take that and you can start to ask, now that we understand where the resources are, what their significance is from a traditional sense, but also a current perspective, then you navigate the future and you start to articulate what the appropriate land use designations are. Sorry, I'm not going to read through these, even though I would like to. I just ate up too much of my time. And again, so once you got these land use, these community-based and traditional values-based land use guidelines, that is what sits between the community and the governmental land use system. The name of the ancient Hawaiian land manager, or konohiki, is actually a compound word that literally means invite, or kono, and abilities or possibilities, hiki. So the konohiki actually acted to invite possibilities. The thing is for today, so if you think about it, the zone, the land use zone and designations does that today. It invites possibilities onto the landscape. But the thing is, it's not informed the same way. It's informed by a different standard and different values, which are not necessarily conducive to sustainability and adapting to a changing climate. Okay, that was a lot. But thank you, folks.
Does anybody have any questions? You can either write them in the chat or unmute yourselves. Go for it, Pete.
Kamuela, do you see any possibility in the future for us moving via action committees or general population toward a more sustainable land management system, since what we have is so inbred? What's it going to take?
Thanks, Pete, for that question. A few thoughts is that it's going to take a working model. I think at first, what could happen is a study for a community could be, a district could be done, and it could be proposed as a guideline rather than actual land use controls meaning like permits would be bounded by them. And it's not that I don't, so I'm just saying what's realistic. I think it would have to start off as a spatial guideline. And it would have to, even though I wrote this as something communities could take this model, they don't have to do it the same way. I just wanted to show that communities with subject matter experts that can actually document what community is trying to say, you can make a communicative tool between community and government that speaks government's language. So even though I said this is something communities can do, I would hope a community would start to endeavor in putting one together, but you would still have to get to the place where it would have to gain ground in the department. And so I actually believe that it would, at the county level, it would require a council person to actually want to say, let's take a look at this, right? Or say, we want a group to go and do this. It would even be stronger if there was some state legislation calling for some modeling that could be possibly worked into the system. But it needs a combination of community willingness and champions, but it needs political support. So thanks, Pete. I think Scott, you got your hand up.
Yeah, no, I'm back. In building off of Pete's question, if there was a model, working model developed, and you know, I didn't have a chance to read through the statement of significance, but can you give some sort of forward-thinking parameters of what might be examples of that would determine when there are locations or resources that are significant versus not, and what, you know, obviously you're drawing a line that might be artificial, but what types of parameters might go into those statements of significant determinations?
So here's an example for that. I'm just going to paraphrase off of the top of my head, but the Lalamilo corridor, I think I called it the Lalamilo Riparian and Vichad corridor, and that was the one running Malka to Makai. And by spatially documenting that, of course, you have this riparian area that used to be perennial, flowing year-round, with native veg along its borders, but also coinciding with trails, right? And so it's like, and again, that those trails are giving you a reference point across the entire district. That's your sense of place. And so a statement of significance reads, being that there is this ecological resource of the Waiula stream network, and that it helps to retain sediment instead, right? And then because there's a trail system in there, and also because from this corridor, you get a sense of place that even tourists would love, right? So sense of place to residents, but also a way for visitors to experience the landscape and respect the landscape in a way that the brochures don't talk about. So it's like, here's the resources. And because we got these resources, we need these types of management in this spatial area that we have now designated. So that's an example of how you convert data to statements of significance to land use guidelines.
Great, thanks a lot. It's pretty exciting to consider the ways one might survey communities to drive that pathway of determination. So thanks a lot, Kamu. Awesome presentation.
Thanks, Scotty.
There was a question in the chat. Do you have any thoughts regarding island shoreline or beach management within your studies?
Oh yeah, Shichao, I think you're the
Yes.
SMA guy.
Yeah,
You're the
thank you.
SMA
Thank
guy,
you.
yeah?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah, so if you saw that one of the commons, there were three main commons that I put. One was the Pu'ukapu watershed common at the top. There was the Lalamilo corridor commons, and then there was a shoreline commons. And then the land uses, so, right? One thing is setbacks, right? Given the sea level rise and all of that thing. I think actually the cultural resources and the trail system, again, add on the environmental impacts of sea level rise. And again, you gather all of these layers and you say, you know, there is more reason to either limit or set back more or increase the standards especially, so I paddle along that coastline, and I know when I pass a certain development, there's a streak in that water and there's a smell in that water, right? But it's layering all of these different, so you layer, I guess what I'm saying is you can layer the traditional and sustainable values, but then on that layer the future impacts and just say, it's for these reasons. Maybe we can't kick out the current developments, but future developments, there is rationale for either limiting the amount, the density, or increasing the standard. If you're going to try in your permitting to keep what the current zoning allows, because of these impacts, wastewater, injection wells, your standard, the standard has to change. That's just my thoughts.
Thank you very much. The reason I asked this question because Hawaii shoreline management definitely is in challenge right now because regulatory, is a parcel by parcel, right? But in fact, shoreline is a regional concept. That's why our program right now do shoreline region and sub-region studies. But we really need this kind of cultural, like you said, zoning and also district concept, regional concept, also Hawaii culture, integrated this kind of management instead of only just parcel by parcel for regulatory parcel property owner only individual issue. So should be instead of with a regional concept. So I really like your study for all this kind of zoning or district with the culture and with kind of Moka to Makai. Yeah, it's really, really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and thanks, Sichao, for being on this. I know that you play an important role and that you've been always advocating for being more precise with how permitting is done at the coast. So really appreciate you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Georgine, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, it's just an overwhelming amount of information, and I can't wait to see the slides as a separate thing so I could actually digest them well. It seems to me the biggest issue is going to be the built community, getting people to move. I think that's a big challenge for us from a climate adaptation standpoint of I live in Montalani Resort, so I'm one of the bad guys, but we're gonna have to move people away from the coastline and then figure out where do we move them. Also the issue of all the growth this island is getting. Where do they go? What's going to be the proper place for them to expand? And I think you're right, the current logic is, well, we got a town here, we'll just make a bigger town. And that can't be the driver. We do need to look at the whole region and how it best works together and deal with the fact that we've got different technology than the old times. And so we've got to figure out, how do you incorporate transportation? How do you incorporate the ability we have to do, for example, wastewater treatment? How do we mesh that with today's reality and the knowledge from the past? And getting over that hump is going to be really tough. And I love the fact that you put together a model to start at least identifying it, get people to see it in front of their face and go, oh, well, maybe that's something we need to consider. Otherwise, I think just people keep doing the same old stuff and the same old mindset forever. So I'm on the Environmental Management Commission, and maybe there's some opportunities there to get a little bit bigger focus on how do we look at what makes the right sense for our land and our people and any future generations who want to come to this island. So thank you very much. And let me know when his slides are available, or if you can give a link to your master's thesis where you put all this together. I'd love to see it.
Thanks, Georgine. What I'll do is I'll send the link and the link takes you to a free downloadable version of the thesis, and I'll send that to Lauren, and then she can disperse it out to
Oh,
everybody.
that'd be great. That'd be great.
And your point is well taken. That is actually the challenge of our day, is that as a land use regime, and regime is not in the bad sense of the word. Regime just means a system.
Mhm.
Even though it's not regulated, there's the perception of land use rights or property rights. Yeah, property rights. And that's the thing about societal stewardship, is that we have to untrain ourselves of entitlements for the sake of the environment, which is actually for the sake of the society. That's the feedback loop that goes on. But we've been trained for so long to think about individual rights. And this is the challenge. That is the greatest challenge. And I'm in my current work with PICAST, that's something that, so this work is going to evolve into that from a systems thinking perspective. I heard somebody say, when a democracy enters the phase of where rights overtake responsibility, the democracy is failing.
No, I certainly would agree with you. We have a kuleana to make the whole system work. And if all you're focused in on yourself, we are going to fail.
Yeah, and coincidentally, when people apply for land use rights via a permit, in the development and real estate game, they're actually called entitlements. And so you see how our discourse reflects the value, again, the political economy of the day. And we live in an entitled society. But again, individual entitlements is not conducive to environmental and therefore societal resilience and health.